Hello and welcome to this another podcast. This time I'm joined in the booth by Mr. Whitehorn, who's appeared in this program before, and Alessandro Giacometto, who's an esteemed historian in the Reading School historical community. This podcast is about the French Revolution, which is something that I think everyone on this little panel knows at least something about. So in order to understand kind of the causes of the French Revolution, we have to go back and look at the structure of the Ancien Régime, which is the name given to the kind of system of the monarchy and how it ruled France. So
let's dig in. What was France like in the run up to the revolution?
So I think we have to be careful using the word feudal in the context of the 18th century, because many European societies, if not in terms of the way they governed their land, had definitely moved on from the feudalism of medieval times. But France in the 18th century was very much a kind of pseudo-feudal society. You know, there was essentially absolute monarchy in the hands of the king, and all the subjects owed complete loyalty to him. There was no semblance whatsoever of democracy in place. The parliamentary body, as it were, the Estates General, hadn't met since 1614, which is an incredibly long time to go without Parliament, given that in England there was a Parliament almost, definitely at least during and post-Civil War. With that kind of parliamentary movement, the Parliaments were almost a permanent kind of establishment and institution. So in France there was effectively no hope in the hands of the people as far as changing the system was concerned, because there was no way of actually enforcing action against both their feudal kind of landlords and against the king himself. And as you see with crisis after crisis of food prices and of wars and everything going on, the people who were worst hit were those who were feudal dependents of the kind of the owners of the land, and they were the ones who suffered time and time again. The French Revolution occurred at kind of the zenith of a harvest crisis, but it wasn't the first time it happened. Repeatedly. So actually, there'd been another major crisis in 1770. Whenever food and finance, whenever food and war whenever food was in short supply and war was going on at the same time, obviously finances suffered, and that then perpetuated the problem. So that was happening again and again in France. So it was really a nation of crisis.
Yes.
So you made the point of England having a parliament or Britain having a parliament, and that gave it kind of numerous advantages over France in terms of how its society was set up. So one of the big advantages that Parliament gave was that it had the right to raise taxes, but also it was still a representative body of the people. So people viewed taxes.
We say representative; it's very representative of a small
yes.
group.
but still, the people who would be were the sort of people who would have stuff to tax, which is to say the landowners, were represented there. Yeah. And so taxes raised by Parliament were essentially raised by that class. This wasn't the case in France, where the king had to raise taxes essentially, and had to be approved by the Parlement.
It's in terms of its contrast with the British system of governance at the time, British society. This is perhaps the most kind of telling contrast and the most stark and actually shocking contrast, because the people with no money were the ones who were contributing the money. So not only was it an oppressive system, an unfair system, it was also incredibly inefficient, because they were trying to collect money from people who effectively had none. And that's why you have so many fiscal problems in France at the time, because they weren't the only nation in Europe fighting war after war after war. I mean, yes, they had 53 years of warfare in the 18th century, which is pretty much more than half the time they were at war. But they were fighting other countries, a lot of the time the same countries in these different various wars. And yet Britain managed to stay on its feet. Why was that? Largely because of the inefficiency of the unformed tax system.
I think we should talk about that, the sort of estate system and the different estates.
But this is still the point. The main advantage that Britain had was also that it had its kind of revolution sort of comparable to France's in the both in the English Civil War and in the Glorious Revolution. You had this move towards the
constitutional monarchy.
Yeah,
exactly.
it was
a constitution. It was almost without wanting to sound too kind of nationalistic and proud. It was almost the best form of revolution in the sense that it was one that actually occurred over time with the course of history. It actually almost wasn't trying to artificially drive history itself, but it was occurring within the circumstances and the situations that were in place. So what with kind of the abuse of kingly power led to, yes, there was an armed struggle, there were many deaths, the highest death toll England's ever seen, but it was a process that actually kind of developed and evolved and matured, whereas in France, because they hadn't seen any change whatsoever, they tried to, very much like with the Bolsheviks, trying to implement a Marxist revolution in a feudal country, they tried to essentially change everything in one blow, and that's why we see the devastating consequences that we do, because you can't change a country and you can't change people's attitudes in such a short period of time in such a drastic manner.
I said the trend towards absolutism is not one that's unique to France at all. Like it's something that's Europe-wide, and it's all about how different countries deal with it. And
it enlightened despotism, they call it.
Exactly.
I was just to go back to the estates system very quickly. I think it'd be good just to go through the estates. So, in France, you have the population split up into these different estates. You have the first estate, which is the clergy, so bishops and priests and things like that. The second estate, which is the nobility, and then the third estate, which is everyone else. And as Alessandro was saying, it's the third estate that's taxed. The first and second estates have massive exemptions and limitations on how much tax.
And in some cases they're allowed to collect taxes themselves, like the churches collect their tithes from the peasants also. This was sort of again that sort of fueled popular discontent against this overall system.
That's the thing. When you look at the demographics of France at the time, it's depending on estimates which vary, it's between 1% and 3% of the population actually belonged to the first and second estate. So the third estate, 97 to 99% of the population comprised only 1/3 of representatives in the Estates General, because the election was by territory, one person per estate, effectively. It was. So in terms of the system of governance, it was not only was taxation grossly inadequately shared and grossly burdened upon the poorer people, but so was their democratic political representation. They didn't have a say, and therefore they couldn't change the system, which was excessively kind of hard on them, as opposed to the other two estates. And that was one of the major problems and one of the major causes of the initial inefficiency of the Estates General, is that the third estate deputies, rightfully so, wanted to have a voice that was at least in some degree proportional to the number of people they were representing, because if the first and second estates wanted, which they very much did, to essentially team up and protect their vested interests, then they could and outvote the third estate in any policy that was being proposed. So this was one of the major issues at hand when the estates was eventually called in. It met in May 1789, but it was called much earlier because the elections had to take place. So there was about 6 months of electoral campaigning, and that was one of the major issues at stake.
So I think all of these inefficiencies in terms of taxation. So the Parlement, which were the
judicial kind of bodies. The semblance of democracy, which many people held as the kind of defence against tyranny, but actually never, as you were saying earlier when we were discussing, whenever they protested against a law which the king really wanted to be enforced, they could essentially be dismissed by the absolutist monarch, who could implement a lit de justice, which would essentially compel them to go along with the laws. So there was the semblance of democracy, like we say, and the French Parlement were nothing like the English Parliament, which was one centralised body that actually had political weight.
But the big problem was that the Parlement didn't like the idea of raised taxes at all.
No.
And I think if you look at the sort of taxes that were put upon France, a lot of them dated back, centuries.
Ancient.
Like the tax on salt, for example.
And this is the great paradox, going back to what you were saying just before, of revolutionary France, is that actually many of the people regarded the parliaments as their defence against tyranny, but the parliaments were largely noble and largely had their own interests at heart. So though they could purport to be opposing the common enemy at the time of the revolution, as people became more and more hostile to the monarchy, they were actually, although they were perceived as being the defence against tyranny, they were largely the ones opposing tyranny in the first, the kind of reform in the first place, because they didn't want the nobles to be taxed largely, and that's why you see as well in the Assembly of Notables, which was a noble and clerical body, massive obstructionism and massive opposition to Calonne, the moderate Control General, who wanted to actually implement some degree of reform with taxes, was unable to do so because the notable people in the country who had political say, all from the upper classes, and were not being taxed, and therefore didn't want taxes to change. And so everyone in any position of power, whether it be the Parliament, this new Assembly of Notables in the Estates General, largely were moneyed, landed men who didn't want things to change.
Yeah, and I think these sort of like outdated modes of taxation, some of which weren't even carried out by the state itself. So you had these systems like the Ferme Générale is so they were I'm not sure how you describe them. They were a body of tax collectors, would you call them?
Essentially, they operated almost, I think, outside of kingly jurisdiction. They were almost like they were employees of the state, but they had autonomy to operate as they wish. So this is another of the problems of pre-revolutionary France is that, like I've already said many times, many people were acting because of the kind of hierarchical structure of society in their own interests, and the people who the government depended on to collect taxes and account for finances were essentially free to kind of funnel off and siphon off money wherever they wanted to, and there was massive embezzlement, which is another problem with the tax system itself. There was the French authorities failed to reform prior to the revolution that contributed to the fiscal crisis. So everywhere you look, there were problems, there were inefficiencies, and so France was eventually destined for, and it did experience fiscal crises. It went bankrupt in 1720 to 21, and again there was another Great Recession in 1770. So there was this kind of, although people at the time wouldn't have been able to see it, looking back on it in hindsight, there was almost this momentum, there was this impending kind of sense that France had to at some point reach breaking point, and what the consequences would be depended on the other contingent circumstances, which again, looking back on it in hindsight, we can see that alongside this great crash was the harvest crisis of 1788, it was post-American War of Independence, so these Enlightenment ideals were spreading across the Channel. France had very much aligned itself with America, and therefore it couldn't therefore extricate itself from the ideals that were driving the American Revolution forward, and of course the influence of the philosophes, Rousseau, Voltaire, Montesquieu, all of these men were there at the time as well, although a couple of them had died, but their ideas had survived beyond them. Their literature was still massively popular among the educated men of France, and so, well, men and women, because actually a lot of the women, although they didn't have political say whatsoever until, in France until 1946 when they didn't get the vote, but the women as well, we see that their importance in kind of the October Rising, the October Revolution, or the October Days is what they call it officially, when they actually marched from the Palace of Versailles, the largely uneducated women who were doing that. This wasn't just a revolution of the powerful educated classes. It was a revolution of all people in society, rich men, rich women, poor women. It was very much something that encompassed everyone, because everyone was affected by these inefficiencies.
So we've mentioned it quite a lot, but I think we should probably now look at what the fiscal crisis was in terms of France had been in quite a few, had been in the wars, in the preceding, in the century before.
Yeah, so many wars.
Let me just try to list them. The War of Austrian Succession. War of Spanish Succession.
And War of the Polish Succession.
Polish Succession.
I've got that in front of me, by the way. I don't know this off the top of my head.
And then there's also the Sun Kings Wars. There's another one of those, but I can't remember.
War of the Reunions. The 9 Years' War, the Williamite Wars in Ireland. And then you have the two kind of famous, big, most devastating wars, which were the 7 Years' War, which is essentially a war that arguably, perhaps, other than World War I, the greatest war of empire the world's ever seen between the French and British empires.
It definitely has a claim to be called World War I.
World War I. I think you're very, very, very right in saying that. Although it was only two powers that were fighting each other, it was two powers and their empires, and these two empires spanned the globe by that point. Apart from, you could argue, Asia was largely uncolonised by this point, but they were fighting. Certainly, that precipitated again the American War of Independence. These two great European powers fighting across the Channel for land the Americans believed to be their own, and then you also get, after that, therefore, the American War of Independence, which France commits to as a means of revenge for their defeat in the 7 Years' War, which is one of the most fatal decisions taken by Louis XVI as king in terms of his eventual deposition amidst the emerging revolution.
So the director of finances at the time of the at the time of the American Revolution was a man called Necker.
Jacques Necker.
Jacques Necker. And he was actually opposed to the getting involved in the war.
Yeah.
Because he rightly pointed out that it would be massively expensive.
Yeah.
And that there isn't actually any money.
Yeah.
And also, just as a result of the kind of stranglehold that the nobility had on the king in terms of kind of fiscal policy and raising taxes, they couldn't raise taxes to pay for the war. So they took out on loan something like 520 million livres.
Exactly that.
Which was a staggering amount.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, you look at that. That's essentially that livre would be the French equivalent of pounds, and you look at this in terms of 200 and whatever years ago. Well, yeah, no, almost 250ish years ago. Not quite, but yeah, this was over 200 years ago, and inflation at the time would have been nothing. Well, it would have been a lot at the time, but in terms of what the value of a livre was, it was nothing compared to now. So therefore, 520 million livres in modern parlance would be billions and billions and billions of pounds. And you look at the wealth of the French monarchy already, and the French state, its coffers were pretty much empty because of what we already discussed in terms of the wars they were committing to and the taxes that they were failing to collect. So that kind of commitment was absolutely devastating to a country.
So he took them out on loan, and in 1781 he published the king's finances, or France's accounts, which I think again you can see was, I think, sort of motivated by Enlightenment ideals. The sort of public scrutiny, sort of like that the nation should be accountable to its people. But at the same time, he also fudged it.
Yes, exactly. It's completely falsified. So honourable as his ideology and his motivations would have been, the compte rendu du roi, which was, like you say, the account of the king's finances, was he effectively omitted, because he was looking at the taxes. He basically, for the first time in history, which is why the people loved him so much, he managed to commit France to war without raising any taxes, which was and obviously people at the time perhaps wouldn't have had that much of a knowledge of fiscal affairs, and so to them this would have made sense. Obviously it didn't, because how can you fight a war without money? It was all loaned out, but he essentially failed to include this information in his compte rendu au roi, which meant that it was almost entirely falsified. He was essentially saying to the country, we fought a war without taxing you.
And then we also ran a surplus for the year.
And we also ran a surplus for the year, which is obviously fake. But like we say, the vast majority of France belonged to the third estate, uneducated, wouldn't necessarily have known the mathematics of it, and were just led to believe that actually, because they couldn't see any direct, immediate impact on their own lives because their taxes weren't being raised, they thought that this man had performed a miracle. Not literally a miracle with it, but they were amazed at what he'd managed to do in terms of manipulating money, and so they really believed in him. Although like you say, didn't want to go to war, was the man arguably responsible for spurning most of France's money in that period.
So Jacques Necker was sacked quite soon after.
Yes.
I can't remember quite when.
I think it was 83, but I wouldn't quote me on that.
Okay. And then the new man came in, which was what's his first name? It's Calonne.
Well, before Calonne there was, actually I think it was 1783, because there was a guy called Turgot, 83 to 84.
Oh,
but then your man Calonne, I think it was Charles Alexandre de Calonne. They all had about 7 names, but I think it was Charles Alexandre de Calonne, and he came in 85, I think. He came in,
and he unfortunately discovered that there wasn't any money.
Yes, exactly. He made the rather obvious discovery, and anyone in his position should have been able to make. Obviously, that he'd been misled, as with the rest of the country, into believing that it wasn't there. This lack of money, which it was, and therefore he presented his findings to the king in what he termed a summary of, basically a financial summary. I'll find the name in a second. I can't remember it. But it essentially said to the king, "Look, we are screwed."
Skint. So now he had to find a bit of cash, which, as we've discussed before, is a tricky thing to do in France before this period. So he has 5 proposals or so. So he has cut government spending, always good, revive the free trade methods. We haven't actually discussed those, but they're all disastrous when they tried to do them. Equalisation of salt and tobacco taxes, and then also authorise the sale of church property.
That's actually quite radical. Actually at the time.
And a 5th one I think was I think it was another tax reform. I haven't got it written down, but So now he needed someone to agree to this, which no one was very keen to do.
Essentially, he proposed all of these ideas in his, I was trying to quote it before, it's called The Summary of a Plan for the Improvement of the Finances. And you were talking about the free trade system as well, just briefly on that. It was a kind of an idea. They had the men in France, the philosophers in France, the philosophes, had proposed as part of their Enlightenment ideals, freer trade, which wasn't regulated by the government. But obviously, France wasn't ready for this because there was so much government control in all other aspects of life. Government price controls had effectively enabled the majority of the population to afford the bread they needed to keep them alive. Calonne now proposed renewing these, which would have been a disaster, as would the rest of his proposals. Nonetheless, he believed in them, the king was led to believe in them by him, and he convened the 144-man Assembly of Notables.
Now, the Assembly of Notables should have been a bit of an easy crowd.
Yeah, it should have been a tick box procedure.
Because the thing is, the king was allowed to choose who gets into it, so he had a bit of an upper hand. But such was the unpopularity of these proposals that the hand-picked representatives who were sent to vote in on this, like it's convened just to vote this through, rejected it.
Yeah,
they absolutely despised these ideas. They were terrible. So now they needed another way to raise taxes, and now we get on to the Estates General.
Well, yeah, just a quick point on that as well. As I was saying before, is another so many, but another kind of fatal paradox is that the men whom the king could rely on for authority in trying to pass reforms were the very men who would be inclined and who would be interested in obstructing them, because he was essentially, his reforms were, he didn't want to take any of the burden, but he knew that there were men with money who could, and therefore we needed their support essentially to incur them to pay more money towards the state, which is kind of a, you'd think now it's very stupid, but it was the only thing you could do.
It wasn't to pay for a war or anything. This was literally just to clear the deficit, which is something that people can't even.
It's a little bit trying to get turkeys to vote for Christmas, isn't it?
Yeah,
exactly. That difficulty in trying to encourage people to limit their own power and their own rights and responsibilities.
So now we have the Estates General, and there was a lot of controversy when the estates were announced, like to reconvene, because as we've discussed before, the Third Estate is a lot bigger in terms of the population represented compared to the other two, and so at that time there was a lot of people demanding that the estates be weighted. You know, their votes should be weighted according to the amount of population represented. And now we have the intervention of Necker again, who said that they should double the number of representatives for the Third Estate, which I suppose could have worked if he hadn't also decided to still give each one one vote. So if the First Estate and the Second Estate vote against something proposed by the Third Estate, then that will still be defeated. So he essentially just, if you consider that the how unpopular the Third Estate was presumed to have been, among the first two, then it wasn't going to be an effective reform.
There was some talk of some sort of alliance between the First and the Third Estate with some of the sort of poorer clergy trying to sort of get involved with this.
Because that was the big surprise of the elections, that the bishops and the more the richer and more influential and more noble, you might say, clergymen weren't returned.
No.
It was actually the parish priests and the abbots and stuff.
And one thing to note as well on the election process is that there was this great feeling when the Estates General was summoned among the people of France, because it was something that no one in their lifetime had seen or experienced. That actually people didn't quite know how it was going to work. People had great hope in it. They called it literally the Great Hope. Historians have, and many of France's peasants were led to believe, arguably by themselves, but by the Third Estate electors, or the people who were elected from the Third Estate, that anything that they proposed would be passed, that they had the power. The Estates General was essentially replacing the king in terms of passing these policies, although the king would still be in place instead of his authority, his kind of prestige. They were essentially telling the people, and the people were led to believe, or that what they were proposing was now going to become policy, that the Estates General had the power to run France and to kind of dictate the government of France. And so the cahiers, which were the list of kind of grievances drawn up and submitted by the people, were expected by the people who had contributed to be to become policy. They were expected that they were making decrees themselves. There was this great misconception among the people that what they proposed was going to happen, and therefore when this didn't occur, because of the obstructionism of the First and Second Estate, and because of actually a lot of the Third Estate not actually agreeing to some extent with what had been proposed, they were expecting perhaps different things to what were contributing. Actually, in terms of putting things into practice, it's all right saying, we want freedom and equality for the people, being inspired by these Enlightenment ideals. When push comes to shove, a lot of Third Estate electors were, a lot of Third Estate deputies were initially reluctant as well. So
I think it's really easy to talk about the three estates as sort of unified bodies. Whereas obviously there's so much sort of, particularly within the Third Estate, there's so much variation. You've got the growing middle classes,
bourgeoisie,
you've got the difference between the sort of city dwellers and the rural peasants is huge. Like what these different groups want is completely different, and so there's real difficulty in getting any sort of homogeneity and sort of unification amongst what the estates actually want.
Some of the Third Estate bourgeoisie were more wealthy than the nobility. The Third Estate covered all spectrums of wealth within French society. So it was there was no guarantee, there was no hope really of getting them all to agree on anything, and that's where the intervention of the people of Paris and the people in the countryside comes in and crucially decides for the revolution where it is headed. And I guess that's something I'll come on to talk about a bit later.
So the Estates General are convened, but the Third Estate splits off kind of after a few weeks or so of the convention? Or?
Yeah, I think it was convened on the 1st of May, and they split off. The tennis court oath is, it's the 20th, 21st of June, so it's within just over a month. They've decided to secede from the body after Louis XVI tried to kind of silence them by locking them out of the meeting hall.
Which is why it was in a tennis court.
Which is why it's in a tennis court.
So that's why it's basically fine to get them all together.
And they pledged to not disassemble until to carry a meeting until they had created a new constitution for France and for the French people.
But I think also it wasn't just the Third Estate that seceded as well.
That's important.
There were a lot of the kind of poor clergymen as well had seceded also, and actually the entire First Estate, I think, actually voted to join the National Convention.
Eventually.
National Assembly even.
And that wasn't an immediate process, because at first it was individuals who were slightly more formed. And because like Mr. White was saying earlier, it wasn't three uniform bodies. It's like in any political party, you're not going to have everyone agreeing on the same policies. There were initially more reform-minded people from the Second and First Estates in the National Assembly, and actually interestingly it was a member of the Second Estate, a member of the nobility, who, perhaps coerced by members of the Third Estate, who initially proposed the Landmark Act to effectively abolish feudalism in France in August. So it shows you that it wasn't, like we say, not everyone had the same hopes, expectations and intentions within the same bodies at all. Again, showing you just how diverse the interests and people of France were at this time, and how hard it was to come to an agreement.
It's interesting as well the sort of similarities between the tennis court oath and the Declaration of Independence.
Massively.
The ideological strands coming through here, and those same sort of ideas. Like this is that sort of. It's that same sort of idea of standing up against the king and we're opposing this.
At this point, I've got. There are some striking parallels between the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen and the US Declaration of Independence. For example, the French Declaration talks about inalienable and sacred rights and the happiness of all. The American Declaration talks about certain unalienable rights and to the liberty and the pursuit of happiness. It's almost paraphrasing the American Constitution. It was so directly inspired by it. So it was effectively the French equivalent of the American Declaration of Independence, and that's what a lot of the enlightened deputies believed that they were doing, was bringing France towards a new American future, as it were, not necessarily towards a bloody, bloodthirsty revolution that would... completely.
Because obviously you have some of those people who've been in America sort of supporting the American War of Independence.
Benjamin Franklin's in France.
Yeah, exactly.
In France.
Lafayette,
Lafayette as well.
who's one of the one of the friends of the new American government. He actually fought at the Battle of Brandywine. He's
back in France.
Yeah.
Like, obviously, he kind of has a complex role in sort of being part of the Second Estate and that sort of conflict of interest and things. But those ideas are very much present in France, and obviously a lot of them had come from France.
Initially,
to America,
to America and back. It's that weird. But it was in America that they were almost universalised, and the people were granted access to them. In France, it was still very much the educated men. Another thing that we have to note, we talk about the Enlightenment as it were inspiring the lower classes to revolt. The lower classes had no way of understanding, no means of learning about the Enlightenment. It was still the educated men. So it was down again the great paradox. It was down to the educated men with vested interests in the current order to bring France towards a new order.
But then you do have, then that's when you're sort of talking about that sort of the rising middle class within the Third Estate and that sort of educated class within the Third Estate, which is arguably driving this revolution. This is arguably not a working class revolution. This is more of a middle class revolution. Obviously,
Lefebvre talks about four different revolutions.
The
famous French historian, arguably the supreme authority in French religion, talks about the aristocratic revolution and the bourgeoisie revolution and the popular and peasant uprising. So he talks about four separate revolutions, which it very much was a process of one of the kind of second most powerful body in society taking power from the most powerful. 4 times over. You have the aristocratic classes from the king, the bourgeoisie from the aristocratic classes, and then the people very much are the ones who find themselves taking power in the later stages.
And of course, at the start, the peasants even are involved in counter-revolutions.
Absolutely.
It was very much a fractured situation.
In the origin of the French Revolution, it indicates that a lot of research kind of points out the fact that many peasants and or not just peasants, but working class urban labourers would have been opposed to revolution, because to them, obviously with the propaganda, with the censorship that had been obstructing their understanding of society for so many years, to them the biggest problem or the biggest threat was absolutism and arbitrary government, which, although in place at the time, was something that they saw revolutionists tending towards anyway. So they wouldn't have supported revolutionary ideals had they known, or were they to believe that it would lead to arbitrary rule, which is very much what they expected, and it's similar.
And the sort of the atheism of the revolution alienated a lot of religious peasants and things like that as well. And there's a lot of things that are not universally popular amongst this revolution. This is not a universal revolution.
And the de-Christianization led to obviously the long war in the Vendée as well. So,
absolutely.
It was very much
the most deadly civil war in although it was not quite a war, it was the most deadly civil war in French history, which just shows you how much people were rebelling against.
And it kind of feels like a sideshow when you talk about French Revolution.
But in itself, it was almost a great civil war.
Just returning to the
chronology.
Returning to the chronology of the revolution itself. So we've had the establishment of the National Assembly, and then Louis XVI moved sort of against the Assembly itself. So he brought in foreign mercenaries, which was a sign, first of all, that to the Parisians that that he was moving against the Assembly, but also it was a sign that Louis himself didn't believe in the loyalty of the French people to kind of himself.
So he brings them in around Paris, doesn't he? He increases that. He brings 4,000 new men into the Parisian police reserve in springtime, and rumours start to circulate, don't they? And that's when we get the infamous, eulogised storming of the Bastille, which was actually more a search for arms and food, and crucially gunpowder, which is what they needed from the Bastille than anything else. But it's come to be this, and it was at the time really hyped up as this great symbol of the people taking control, the people winning a military victory.
Because the Bastille housed the political enemies of the French crown. In the pre-revolutionary period, actually, I don't think there
was like 3 or 4.
There are about 7. And
it's mainly just a massive store of gunpowder and weapons.
But it's this icon of the great tyranny and arbitrariness and oppression of the feudalist regime, the ancien regime.
The views of the Bastille itself, if you look at the artwork around it, it's always this huge towering castle. It's actually a very low prison. It's around the same height as the rest of the houses in the area, but again, it shows that the in the kind of minds of the people,
Yeah.
you know, a lot of this artwork is from the revolution itself, not in hindsight. Shows that they believe the Bastille to be this huge, you know, representative of the king, towering over the common people.
I mean, that's what we support now. That's what the French people celebrate.
Bastille Day.
Currently, Bastille Day. That is for them the symbol of revolution. Although in terms of its consequences, yes, it enabled the French people to arm themselves, but it wasn't the most significant event within the context of the French Revolution. Even in the causation of it, the revolution was already very much although it was arguably on its last wheels at this point, it was in motion. And yes, the Bastille might have saved it, but it didn't cause it, and that's where the misconception lies.
Yeah, it's very similar to the storming of the Winter Palace in the
Russian
Bolshevik Revolution, which similarly is held up as this like great sort of final tearing down of the monarchy, where it's just some like drunk soldiers getting let in the back door.
And you have these huge have these huge paintings, just like the Bastille, of these like you know
it's commemorated every year, isn't it?
of the people, you know, they're like storming down the
the
palace guards.
Reenact it every year. Thousands more and more people every year, and it's
it was guarded by a volunteer regiment of.
There's the cadets and the sort of women's regiment.
I mean, almost the entirety of the original government. By this point, Kerensky, I think, was already
fled.
So again, it was an empty. It was almost an empty building, just like Bastille. Very, very striking parallels.
Yeah.
So, but they both serve the same purpose as the figurehead of the revolution.
That sort of symbol.
Yeah. So, after the assembly had been kind of set up, it is the assembly, isn't it? Yeah. The king is sort of put under. Not quite house arrest, but like close to.
He's effectively whilst the Estates General is still in session, he's effectively deprived of all political power. And they passed resolutions without his approval. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, the abolition of feudalism, none of these were approved by him until the October Days, which we touched on briefly earlier. Because he was very much an opponent of the revolution. What triggered the October Days is actually he held. Firstly, the kind of fact that bread prices continued to rise to a level not seen since I think 1770, in spite of what was going on in terms of trying to mitigate this in the Estates General. But he held a party, Louis XVI, in which the French tricolore, which was now already coming to be used as a symbol of the French Revolution, this kind of croquette, he trampled it on the floor. And the news of this was spread by Marat and his L'Ami du Peuple, the French journal that was hugely influential in terms of inciting revolutionary and violent fervour. And the people heard of this, and the women, as I was talking about earlier, who were starving and who had no means other than enforcing change through their own physical intervention of obtaining food, stormed, along with many of the disenfranchised members of the National Guard, they stormed the Versailles. They stormed the palace at Versailles, essentially. They camped outside it, and after their demands for the king to return to Paris weren't met with immediate kind of approval, with immediate submission, they actually broke into the palace and tried to locate Marie Antoinette, and was screaming things about ripping her to shreds. Fortunately, from her point of view, she managed to shelter herself in the king's apartments before this happened. But it just shows the extent to which already people were promoting and crying for murderous sedition.
Is that thing where, like, obviously when this all sort of starts, the Estates General and things like that, there's no assumption that this will end with the execution of the king and the sort of even the removal of
the majority, even later radicals like Robespierre were initially incredibly opposed both to the death penalty and staunch supporters of a constitutional monarchy.
It's sort of parallels with the English Civil War in that sort of situation where it's only sort of as the sort of situation develops that you get towards a situation where regicide is possible. In 1789, I don't think many people are thinking about that at all.
No, and other than maybe Marat.
I mean, even among the most, as you say, ideologically fixed of the revolutionaries, like Robespierre was obsessed with the idea of revolution. But he even couldn't conceive of a...
Well, actually, interesting anecdote is that when Robespierre was still a student in one of the French universities, the university was paid a visit, the college was paid a visit by the king and queen, Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette, and Robespierre, as one of the most esteemed law students, gave a speech essentially eulogising monarchy and saying, praising the king and queen. It's one of those great ironies, again, it's like Vladimir Lenin and his brother being hanged, you know, it's one of those personal events where he was, essentially, when he was giving the speech to the king and queen, they were not listening at all, they were involved in their affairs. You think, obviously, this wasn't the main motivator.
But
it's one of those interesting anecdotes where you think he was initially, obviously, when he was young and less, the situation was different. He was initially a man who was in favour of the monarchy retaining its power, and yet when we see the monarchy being forcefully relocated to Paris, which is what happens at the end of the October days after they break in, the women and guards break in, and the king's guards, the royal guard of the palace, many of them are beheaded. Their heads are placed on spikes. It's at this point where we really see revolution being implemented in what we traditionally perceive it as very much a bloody French Revolution. The king is moved to Paris with the heads on spikes paraded in front of him. The National Assembly follows, relocates from Versailles to Paris, and it's at this point where we see the will of the Parisian and arguably French people, though we could have debates about that all day long as well, being really actually the driving force behind the revolution and actually taking precedence over the king's will, which is a huge moment, and arguably for many people that's when the revolution truly was launched and truly became an irreversible process.
So I think during this time, the real reason they wanted to keep Louis in Paris was so he couldn't flee. Essentially.
And so he couldn't really do any. He didn't have any political say because he was essentially, like you said, kept under house arrest.
But I think that was a major concern because a lot of aristocrats at the time, who were opposed to the revolution, obviously. Fled to Austria, Prussia, the Austrian Netherlands, etc. And they started sort of like going to the monarchs of these countries saying, this doesn't look great. Can we get rid of it?
Well, the British ambassador to France, Lord Dorset, wrote to King George III on the eve of or a couple of days after the storming of the Bastille, and his words are really telling in terms of what he fears might be the consequences for European monarchy as a whole of this revolution. So it wasn't just a national affair. In the international community had vested interest in the outcome and ultimately in the crushing of this revolution.
There's huge fear all over Europe that this is, especially in Austria and Prussia, because this sort of wave of revolution is potentially coming to them. You still have absolutism around Europe.
If she were to be executed, if she were to be killed, which at the time again, mainly kind of only the extremists are thinking of this, but it's very much inconceivable. But they still think any harm that comes to Marie Antoinette is harm to a member of the Austrian royal family, so they're being directly affected by this as well. And you see her later collusion with the Austrians during the war demonstrates the fact that France very much perceived their enemy not only as being internal aristocrats, but the external international community that was attempting to reimpose on them the pre-revolutionary regime.
And of course, so Leopold II of Austria and Frederick William II of Prussia came together to make the Pillnitz Declaration, which advocated for
border raids on France.
So it was like they threatened to militarize essentially. And at this point, maybe we were starting to see the revolutionary wars essentially.
The rise of paranoia within France as well, because obviously they're still in a kind of state of absolute turmoil there that you'd think. I mean, it's incredible actually looking back at it. They were able to organise an army and actually win. Ultimately, wars largely down to we'll often attribute it later to the great commander Napoleon Bonaparte. We say, but one man himself can't do that. There was armies being kind of mobilised on the borders when the revolution still was very much on the brink of, or very much lacked any sort of security or guaranteed permanence.
Because the Battle of Valmy, which was a war, which was part of the war between the forces of France and forces of Austria, was also sort of a very significant battle because at the might have been Austria and Prussia, but at the pivotal moment of the battle, the French general kind of took off his hat and said "Vive la nation." It wasn't like "Vive le roi" or anything. It was
interesting.
It was again this this idea of the nation is now actually coming to the fore.
And then the sovereignty idea from Rousseau's 1762 social contract, that sovereignty resides in the people. They no longer need the king. And again, with the fears of conspiracy, the correct fears that he was actually writing to and somehow managing to get communication to foreign powers, this paranoia grew in France, and there was a rising sentiment now, in contrast with what we said earlier, that in order to win the war, the king must be muzzled, and then you get the extreme members of the kind of fringes of the National Assembly actually pushing for ultimate action. Robespierre famously said that the king must die so that the revolution might live, which again, if you look at with his standpoint, his stance just 3 years previously on the death penalty, where he was utterly, absolutely opposed to it because he believed that, no one has the but he essentially now is calling for the death of the king. It just shows the extent to which the revolutionary fervour and the circumstances had induced him into essentially becoming a murderer, a mass murderer, which is what we later see as the leading force in La Terreur, which is the period which France enters amidst all this paranoia, amidst all this counter-revolutionary activity, both internal, as we were saying, with the civil wars going on. I can't remember the name of the Vendée, thank you, and with the wars of the coalitions on the French border, with the kind of turmoil this is causing and with the losses that the French are facing, Robespierre sees the only way of guaranteeing the revolution as being, and he's very much incited by who I was mentioning earlier, Marat, the journalist, the editor of L'Ami du Peuple, who effectively his solution to any kind of threat is to just chop off more heads. And every time the threat increases, he calls for more and more heads to be chopped off, and eventually his own, his head isn't chopped off actually, he's stabbed to death. But the point is, violence is causing and resulting from violence, and it's just this kind of perpetual cycle that Robespierre falls into and leads the French Revolution, maybe not single-handedly, but certainly with the collusion of bloodthirsty men into what we now know it as, which is we define it by La Terreur, which wasn't what everything that it stood for, but it was what it descended into.
Yeah, for sure. We should probably jump back to the flight to Varennes and the sort of
so
bringing the
this is June 1791. King Louis is quite obviously a bit scared at this point, which you probably would be, to be fair. And so he decides to try to make a run to a loyalist general and his camp, which I can't remember where it is, but he escapes Versailles, I suppose.
Well, he's in Paris.
He's in Paris. Yes. So he escaped.
Run for the nearest border.
It's a bit of a comic.
They disguise.
They're disguised as bourgeoisie, I think.
Servants. I think. They disguise themselves. I don't know how they would manage to get away with travelling in a carriage. How anyone would buy them, but they managed to get within miles of the border, didn't they? And then they were stopped by a local official.
They got to Varennes and
and then frog march back basically.
The official actually, the first official who saw them was someone who obviously many people stood in completely awed and bowed by the royal kind of prestige and authorities. The first official who saw them confirmed the rumours that were already circulating, and he actually was inclined to let them go. But obviously, with the National Guard being set up around France by this point, revolutionaries in place everywhere, determined to stamp out any counter-revolutionary activities, kill any counter-revolutionaries, now saw the king and queen as abandoning their country, effectively committing treason and committing themselves to a counter-revolution. And so they marched them back to Paris, and it was at this point that actually pushes that the king was put on trial. Marie Antoinette was actually killed about a year later, but the king was put on trial for treason as Louis Capet, as Mr. Juan said earlier, not as the king. And it's at this point that the French Revolution becomes the French Revolution. It becomes a truly seditious, anti-monarchical quagmire.
I think it's that thing as well of the flight to Austria, like a way to these, especially when you've got that sort of the revolutionary wars starting up, opposition to the revolution, and it's now that Louis, he's not even that he's just deserting his country, but he's now sort of consorting with the enemy as well, and really sort of bringing that. But obviously, you still do have a year from the fight to Varennes to the abolition of the monarchy, and then a few more months to those executions. But that's very much a key thing, and like I was saying, that transition from potentially a constitutional monarchy to he's got to go
Republicanism.
And you can definitely blame Louis for some of these problems.
Oh yeah,
it's not like in some ways he can be seen as this kind of like bystander of this system, the product of the system, but a lot of his actions demonstrate a real lack of understanding.
It's later summer 1781 we were saying earlier that many of the peasants saw revolution as something that was undesirable because it might result in even greater abuse of power than was already in place. And actually, even as late as summer 1789, when the Estates General was already in place, had already been elected and convened, and was already discussing change for France, there were riots in Paris, the Réveillon riots for bread. And many of the rebels actually cried, "Long live the king!" They were storming. They were storming these kind of bread. They were storming bakeries and seizing bread, and because they believed that they were acting, that the king was on their side, that the king wanted them to be fed, but he was being obstructed by aristocrats, which to some extent he was, but the king didn't really care about the peasants, let's be real. But nonetheless, they believed the king to be on their side. So again, this incredible transition, as with Robespierre, within the space of 3-4 years, from being very much allied with the king to being very much down with the rich, down with privilege, to being men who were prepared to see their king die, just as the Englishmen had been 150 years previously.
Certainly, like the contrast between, so for example, he went to the Hotel de Ville, or Hotel de Ville, after the storming of the Bastille, where he took a tricolore cocarde and tried to like look revolutionary somehow, and everyone said God save the king or whatever, and then coming back from Varennes, the whole of Paris was in silence. Like, because it's like, not even like hatred, it's just like disbelief and shock. So he was...
The king must be killed, was essentially the general consensus at that point, if the revolution is to continue, if the revolution is to progress. And so it was almost the lesser of two evils, but many people actually were genuinely and actively in favour of seeing their king.
Is that increasing fear amongst the revolutionary leaders that what we've fought for, what we've pushed forward is under threat, and that this is that we need to take serious, drastic action to protect what we've been working on?
So like, I think around this time, I'm not sure, but Robespierre actually makes the remark that he would himself be willing to die in order to like continue the revolution. So it's a lot of revolutionary fervour. And I think, just to skip forward a bit, so the National Convention is
the renamed.
But it's established in 1792, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and it's got, so the Jacobin Club, which is something that we haven't...
Yes, the difference between the Jacobins and essentially the Jacobins are the extremists, the Girondins are their moderates.
Effectively. So the Jacobin Club, it was a bit of a broad church. It had like the Herbertists, which were like the extreme faction, and also had the Montagnards, and the Montagnards were called that because they sat right at the top of the convention's chambers, so they were up in the gods essentially. And that the Montagnards included Robespierre and such like, and as we said before, like even within the revolutionaries there were a lot of factions. So the Girondists, as we said, even tried to save the king. I think.
At his trial there was very much split opinion. Obviously his conviction for treason was a given, but many people there was a great divide on how to actually punish him, and the Girondists took the lead in promoting, insisting on protection for the king, even if he is to be demoted and stripped of his titles, because they were sticking to the enlightened
despotism.
Or to the enlightened origins of the revolution, which was why they were abhorred, as they would later be with Latailleur, by the needless waste of life. There was this very much, there was pragmatism versus idealism, and the clash was devastating.
It's the difficulty of moderates within a revolution.
You see it with every revolution, the mention of the Russian Revolution.
And also, all the left SRs, that was what they were called in the 1917 revolution. They were sort of like in that they were like voted onto Soviets and stuff like that, but then, and of course they were so popular that the Bolsheviks essentially took all the power away from Soviets in the end. So again we see, later in history, the extreme pragmatism of the Bolsheviks, who were
the ruthless, deadly pragmatism, which is actually, they probably ultimately, in terms of the course of the revolution, did what we might term in inverted commas the right thing. But it's whether whether the cost, it's always that eternal question, that we have whenever revolutions occur is how much violence is justified to ensure political and social progress, and that's what ultimately defines the Red Terror and La Terror. There's so many parallels between the two revolutions, but those periods of violence come ultimately to define most revolutions, which is.
Because of the kind of conflict within the convention itself, the Committee of Public Safety is established.
It's a wonderful name, isn't it?
Public safety is a bit of a euphemism.
It's like
it sounds like
1984-ish.
It sounds like something that you'd have like on the council or something. That you might get a letter from the Committee of Public Safety.
That big message like. There's a big banner, something basically a massive contradiction like war is peace. Essentially, that's what they're saying.
Yeah, it was public safety so long as you weren't an enemy.
Public safety, which ended up actually causing huge havoc and devastation and murder and death all across Paris.
So this was dominated by the Montagnards and Robespierre especially, and
incorruptible.
In the time they were in power, France was still beset by these internal and external, you had, there was I think a war in the Austrian Netherlands, for example. There were like these civil wars breaking out, in as we said, the Vendée and stuff like that. So these people took it upon themselves to ensure public order and the continuation of the revolution, and I think they signed in the end about 17,000 death warrants or something.
Just very, very extraordinary numbers. I mean, they continually were drawing up more and more lists. I have a list of counter-revolutionaries who must be getting, and it's incredible to see these 12 men of the Committee of Public Safety having so much influence. The power was consolidated in their hands. They were essentially, they were acting as gods. They were choosing between who should live and who should die, and even the slightest kind of, even not showing enough, they had spies all over Paris, infiltrating even like bread queues, and even a lack of enthusiasm for the revolution could be enough to warrant your death. And it was just a reign of terror.
And it becomes incredibly, there's a ton of infighting within the Committee of Public Safety as well, and you have like Danton and obviously ultimately
Robespierre ultimately commits to killing Danton and the Dantonists as counter-revolutionaries. And there's quite a lot of there's a series of famous quotes that he supposedly said, Danton, as he was sent to the guillotine, and one of the famous ones is, "My only regret is that I was killed before this, swine." Basically, he calls Robespierre a pig. He essentially says, "This is a disgusting man," blah blah, and obviously you would expect that because he's sending him to death, but it just shows the extent to which these two initially collaborating men, they were initially very much in favour of kind of violence to ensure the revolution, but once the revolution had been largely secured, once the fighting within France had been largely quelled, Danton was very much for a return to order, whereas Robespierre had been taken over by this psychosis.
So Danton has the best last words ever as well. Remember to show my head to the crowds, it's worth seeing.
That's good.
Wonderful.
Got to flex on one last time. So Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety were originally, obviously, the fact that you might get beheaded was one major deterrent, but also the fact that there were legitimate dangers to the revolution, was what justified it in the first place. But as these victories against Austria and Prussia stacked up, the need for this kind of violence sort of subsided.
And Robespierre decided not only to keep it at the same level, but actually to augment it and escalate it with the conversion of La Terreur into La Grande Terror, the Great Terror, the kind of peak of violence, until eventually we see him coming into the National Convention for one last time, and essentially making the great mistake of saying that he has a list of counter-revolutionaries who will be killed, but not actually presenting the names and ensuring their executions until the next day when he comes in with the names, at which point the convention turns on him and he is essentially subject to popular arrest and executed himself.
And that's the thing, because he said that there were enemies within the National Convention. But the thing is, at that point, anyone could be an enemy. If he could execute Danton for being a counter-revolutionary, then everyone...
It's almost the Stalinist mentality, isn't it? It's anyone who threatens not only the power, not only the course and progress of the revolution, but my own personal position at this point. He'd almost succumb to megalomania at this stage.
And
sure.
at this point, they all rose up against him and arrested him.
Yeah.
And
the revolution begins to sort of eat itself to some
Yeah.
extent.
And then it kind of descends into 5 years of stagnant. The power base is very much undecided for another 5 years as the wars actually begin to turn in France's favour and go better and better for them under the command of that famous young military officer Napoleon Bonaparte. And then historians debate what point the revolution ends, whether it does end before Napoleon's rise or whether actually the defeat of Napoleon is the end of the French Revolution. But this is where we see it kind of loses its initial intensity and it becomes just a regime almost at that point.
And obviously there's the great irony of Napoleon Bonaparte, who's king, emperor, more than king, emperor of France, still trying to use the language
most of Europe at one point.
Yeah, still trying to use the language of the revolution to inspire. So I think just kind of moving on to the outcome, the kind of overall influence of the revolution. So obviously it gave Napoleon his big shot. There's no chance that he would have become king under another monarchy.
And then the return, the restoration of though brief and although not quite, not total, but the restoration of monarchy in France.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? Because we talk about the French Revolution being an end to the monarchy, but then there was 5 years or maybe more. Yeah, there's about a decade before the proclamation of the French Empire by Napoleon, and then there was the Louis Philippe, the Citizen King, wasn't it?
Yeah.
No.
Well, you have the restoration of the monarchy.
Yeah.
And then you have another revolution in 1830 when
that's the Les Miserables.
It's
the second revolution.
And then after that, there's 1853, or I think, which is.
In fact, we have 5 French republics. Just demonstrates. The fourth was there were 3 different French republics established prior to the Second World War, each with the intention of restoring France to true republicanism. So, but in terms of the effects as well. No, actually, go on. Where were you going to go? Because I was going to.
I was just making the point that probably I think there was a monarch ruling France for a sizable portion of the 19th century as well. But you can certainly make the claim that the example put by the French Revolution is one that inspired later revolutionary periods. So if you look at the revolutions of 1848, what were they fought for? So if we look at Germany, it was fought for this idea of liberty. It had
almost also nationalistic unity.
Exactly.
Because there was so much nationalism stirred up by the French Revolution, given the international threat to it. And again, looking at it on a more sanitary level as well, if you look at the origins, or at least the ideological origins, what we can identify as being the things that inspired, if not the causation of the revolution, certainly its progression from its genesis. The kind of ideals of democracy, of sovereignty residing in the people, of all men being created and remaining equal, fair trial for all humans, and not being questioned or persecuted for your beliefs. These were ideals that were ingrained in and almost defined by, although we see them appearing to some extent in the American Declaration of Independence, it was the French Revolution that brought them permanently to Europe, and that actually, with the great cataclysm and violence that it caused, really demonstrated to the world the power of these sentiments and of these kind of political ideologies, that actually the people should be the ones responsible for their own governments from thenceforth, and that's where we see arguably the rise of republicanism. Although we saw a king being deposed in England in the English Civil War, deposed and beheaded, this was the first time arguably that republicanism was installed in a country that wanted it to last, and that was committed to never seeing the restoration, though it does happen, but it was committed certainly at the time to never seeing the restoration of monarchy. It was the end of almost of the first phase of European history, you can argue, because we've always been governed.
A lot of people start modern history with the French Revolution.
Exactly.
And the words of Zhu Enlai. What have been the consequences of the French Revolution? It's too early to say.
It's true. But it's true. Things inspired and caused by the French Revolution still continuing to this day.
You look at what preceded the French Revolution, it was thousands of years of rule by individuals, whether it be tribal chiefsmen, kings, whatever. That was a period of 1,000 years. We've only had 200 years since. Who knows what might happen, what might come, what might be the end of this next great stage of history. And we're living in the post-revolutionary era still. So
yeah, and I think also it caused a kind of move towards, like, you know, a move away from absolute monarchy, even if it didn't result in a revolution, let's say in Germany, in Prussia, or in Austria. We still have this sort of like rise of a sort of new mode of governance, really.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, like it's very much that, like, it's something that has to be reacted to all over the world. Like, it's something that obviously the increasing violence of the revolution means it's something that's often reacted to by turning away from it quite sharply. But the problems that caused the French Revolution are still really present, and people have to, and governments and groups all over the world have got to react to
it's
what's
a
happening.
thing that actually provoked great fear, and largely this fear was responded to by moderates, and actually the French Revolution almost scared, for example, the British monarchy into increasing reform and tempering it of its kind of continuingly autocratic ways. Although we had parliament, power, sovereign, supreme power still resided in the monarchy, we didn't see that change until after the French Revolution. So arguably it had something to do with that, and so it was like, something you couldn't ignore, effectively.
Definitely. And like the role of, like, so for example Metternich in Austria, again it was that moderation of absolute power, you know, it's these sort of like little concessions.
Like the treaty, I think it was the Treaty of Vienna, where it essentially divided Europe, hugely affected by the French Revolution in terms of
massively. Like it's trying to restore normality.
But in an altered form almost. It's essentially giving the principle. It kind of legitimises the principle of sovereignty of the people, although it's not necessarily talking about people. It's giving sovereignty to many nation states and essentially entrusting their own governance into their own hands, which is the kind of macrocosm of what we see within the states themselves, which is power to the people, which is huge. And again, 50 years on from Napoleon, we see Karl Marx and his Communist Manifesto, definite consequence of that in some way or another. I mean,
and the ideals inspired by like Rousseau and the people around at the time, you know, were definitely like played on the formation of Marxism. Although obviously Marx didn't accept all of it, all of the conclusions.
It inspired so much of it.
Things like Rousseau saying the world, like, you know, the land belongs to no one, and stuff like that.
Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains.
Exactly.
In everything, in every way, man is being exploited and manipulated and enchained by his leaders.
But another good observation that Rousseau makes there is, and those who rule are also in chains. It's like, you know, it's like a dialectic.
Well, again,
you know.
Once again, it's that. We don't even have time to go into it. It's a kind of paradox. It is that everything has to change. It's essentially from the French Revolution. There are so many ills in society that are demonstrated not only by the motivation to revolution, but also by what it descends into, that it affects in all aspects of its being, not only its causation, but what it turns out to be. It affects so many things and so many kind of future events and processes, and we're still learning the lessons from it today, in terms of the fact that revolution, ever since arguably because America was born out of revolution itself, and yet we see this American fear, although it was largely of communism, but of revolution itself. Arguably, again, that intrinsic fear is touched on by things such as the French Revolution, which inspired other revolutions elsewhere, and so it's everywhere, the French Revolution.
It really is. I think that's probably a good time to end it on a good note.